Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland at 7. My guest this evening is a retired SNP MSP and former Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament, Linda Fabiani. Hello, Linda. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Hi there.
We're going to be doing things a wee bit differently tonight. Usually I read out lots of news and we have a wee chat afterwards, but Linda and I thought we'd shake things up a bit this evening. So we'll be going through the Ukraine update, and then we're going to sort of look at some of the stories in more depth and have a longer, more relaxed chat, see how that goes. So I hope you're up for it, Linda. The Ukraine update, day 330. Governor of Kyiv, Oleksiy Kuleba, has said 10 adults and 6 children remain in hospital following Wednesday's helicopter crash, which claimed the life of Interior Minister Denis Monastyrsky and 14 other people. Mr. Kuleba said families of the victims will receive financial assistance and that children from the kindergarten damaged when the helicopter fell are studying in nearby preschools. Ukraine state broadcaster Suspilne is reporting that 11 people are still considered missing after Saturday's attack on a high-rise building in Dnipro. The Kremlin said on Thursday that Ukrainian strikes on Russian-annexed Crimea would be extremely dangerous. This will mean raising the conflict to a new level that will not bode well for European security, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters at his daily briefing. Sweden has announced it will be sending the Archer artillery system, a vehicle-mounted self-propelled gun howitzer made by Bofors BAE and infantry fighting vehicles, to Ukraine. Germany has said it will send German-made tanks to Ukraine so long as the United States agrees to do likewise. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier promised further military support to Ukraine and warned the incoming defence minister that Germany's armed forces must once again become capable of protecting the nation. Social Democrat Boris Pistorius was officially made minister on Thursday in a ceremony attended by Steinmeier. Volodymyr Zelensky has stepped up calls for the Ukrainian army to be supplied with heavy tanks and urged resolve and speed of decision-making from Western allies. Dmitry Medvedev, the hawkish long-term ally of Vladimir Putin, has warned of a nuclear escalation if Russia is defeated in Ukraine. Canada has announced it will donate 200 armoured personnel carriers to Ukraine during a visit to Kyiv by Canada's Defence Minister Anita Anand. Bulgaria helped Ukraine survive Russia's early onslaught by secretly supplying it with large amounts of desperately needed diesel and ammunition. Former Bulgarian Minister Kirill Petkov and Finance Minister Asen Vasilov have said. Polish President Andrzej Duda has warned delegates at the World Economic Forum in Davos that Russia could be planning a new offensive in coming months, calling on countries to provide Ukraine with weapons. Ukraine reported intense fighting overnight in the east of the country, where both sides have taken huge losses for little gain in intense trench warfare over the past 2 months. Ukrainian forces repelled attacks in the eastern city of Bakhmut and the nearby village of Klitschivka, the Ukrainian military said. Russia has focused on Bakhmut in recent weeks, claiming last week to have taken the mining town of Soledar on its northern outskirts, which is a fairly critical tactical location. I don't know if you've been following the news coming out of Davos today regarding Ukraine, Linda, but it certainly seems as though the conversation is moving from the criticism actually that has been leveled at the West, that they are sort of they're supplying enough for Ukraine to defend itself, but not enough for Ukraine to win the war. And there seems to be something of a shift happening now with a number of governments looking
Yeah,
to perhaps move things forward.
yeah. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the European countries and their ongoing commitments because you mentioned there Sweden, Germany, Bulgaria, and Poland, all being much more vocal. And I think yeah, there does seem to be a shift, a real recognition that this just isn't just about Ukraine. It's about what would happen if Ukraine was defeated. What next? And I think they're really starting to feel that way now. So then when you go across the Atlantic, you've got the US and Canada as well. And it's in their interests for Europe to be as Europe is, other than what Russia are doing. So yeah, I do think there's a bit of a shift, and perhaps some of that might be about recognizing that Belarus really does seem to be moving towards full support of Russia, and concerns that that'll escalate things even further. So, and I think too, it's I don't think any of them expected it all to last this long. If you remember at first, well, Russia was saying it was going to be a short war. And I think Western leaders sort of sat back just to see what was happening. Uh, Ukraine under Zelensky has, just made such a strong and brave defense of their country that I think Western leaders are, recognizing that Ukraine's not giving in. And this isn't all going to be over very, very quickly. And there are indeed wider implications for the rest of us. And can I just say, I feel so sorry for them about that helicopter crash. It's just so awful to happen in the midst of all this. And, you see the reports saying, well, it wasn't Russia that did it in terms of blowing the helicopter out the sky or anything like that. But if Russia wasn't invading Ukraine at the moment, these people probably wouldn't have been flying about in a helicopter. I've read reports too that it was difficult because the lack of electricity in the city and things like that. So yeah, Russia is to blame for this. Um, so yeah, how much
It's
longer?
interesting. I was listening to a spokesperson from Ukraine saying that actually one of the issues is that the helicopters that they're using, the machinery that they're using, the equipment they're using is not designed for the intense use and the low maintenance. Um,
Right.
that it's so. So the high level of maintenance that would be expected that can't be maintained in a war situation, and he was saying that also there's also the possibility that fatigue has played a part in this. So I thought it was very interesting, as you say there,
Yeah.
that as Zelensky was saying the other day, that actually if Ukraine had not been invaded by Russia, then none of this would be happening. It's very
Yeah.
interesting to see that the Russians do keep coming back to this dangling the sort of the waving of the nuclear threat. And I do
Uh-huh.
wonder, as somebody who has spent many decades watching the sort of the nuclear issue with a considerable degree of interest, I do wonder what it is they're hoping to achieve with this. If it's for a domestic audience to make them feel that
Mm.
whatever happens, Russia's still strong. In the way that I'm not sure if they still do it or not, but I remember for many decades they would, march after these big nuclear weapons, a sort of phallic
Oh,
display
do
of
you know,
might through Red Square.
Ruth, see you just saying that. I remember as a child, there was a programme that was on every Wednesday night before the Hollywood musical, which was called All Our Yesterdays. And I remember quite clearly as a child sitting watching Red Square, and just as you say, it was a march past with the Russian army, the soldiers all marching, and then they would parade all the tanks and then all the weapons. And
They still
it
do it.
was,
I mean, it still happens every year.
I
But
scared. I mean, really scared as a child because I mean
yep,
that would be in the 60s. And I remember asking my mum, what are they doing that for? And and she had told me a wee bit about the war. And then I remember as an adolescent being really, really scared of nuclear war, terrified. And we had these programs on telling you what to do in the event of a nuclear war. You know, yeah, like go at that. What else are you going to do? Um, And yeah, it was scary, scary stuff. So Russia has always had this thing about parading their strength. Whether it was under the old regime before the Soviets and now they still do. And I think probably maybe not the original Soviets, but those that are there now and profess to still be, um, it's just it just absolutely horrifies me because all this talk about being on the left, and they're socialists and they're on the left. They've gone round that circle, and they are no more than the worst of right wing, and they're fascists now, and it's absolutely
It is
horrendous.
it's very interesting the way in which they keep trying to hark back to the Second World War and referring to it seems it's that gaslighting that seems to happen with a lot of very right of center or far right or fascist or growingly fascist regimes that they refer to the others, those that they're trying to oppress as the fascists or as the Nazis and
Absolutely,
but what
and they
happens
dwell.
when yes,
I was just
it's
saying they dwell on past glory, and it's all
or
about
perceived past
being.
glories.
It's the one. It's well perceived past glories, absolutely, and it's all about being better than anyone else, stronger than anyone else, and they can talk all they like about what they did in the Second World War. Actually, see where they're at now. Well, it's not that far removed.
Well, the Holocaust Museum is a remarkable organization, and they often use the hashtag "not long ago, not far away," and I think that we're often
Mm.
at a time when we're being told that the UK government is considering legislation to stop any positive remarks about coming to the UK in small boats. That people may
Yeah,
now
like
be
we
banned.
can't talk about Dunkirk. Very good.
So, but what do you
You
think the
know,
implications are for? I mean, for
wonderful.
example, it's there's a growing, I mean, a significant number of people within Scotland, and it's Scottish government policy, and it's pro independence policy to get rid of Trident. There's a very strong view that having Trident, less than 30 miles from Scotland's most populous city, is an extremely bad idea for a number of very good reasons. Um, but there are those who say that if Scotland became independent and sought to join NATO, that it wouldn't be able to do as Sweden is suggesting and remain anti, have no nuclear weapons, but that the anti-nuclear policy would perhaps be an issue within the defence of Europe. How does that do, do you think that in the light of a sort of Putin-esque threat, the commitment to end nuclear weapons in Scotland is one which will hold up if and when Scotland does become independent?
Aha, and it's an interesting one. First of all, can I say, that the justification always for holding nuclear weapons is about it being a deterrent. Well, I think when you're faced with somebody like Putin, nothing's a deterrent because he doesn't care about his own people either. That's quite clear. So there's no deterrent there. I think probably people may well get a wee bit more concerned about the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons because they still think of it as a deterrent. But I think that's very different um, from the very, very strong feeling that there is right through civic society in Scotland that they certainly shouldn't be in Scotland and based here. You've got to bear in mind some of that is about why have we got to have them? Uh, you know, so there may well be people there who are not all for nuclear disarmament, but don't see that it's or don't think it's fair that the UK's nuclear arsenal is sitting at Faslane. So there may well be people there who, as you say, when Scotland becomes independent, feel a wee bit differently than they might feel now. I think, though, that Scotland's history of anti nuclear will be enough to take that through. Now, people don't realise it, but it's still Labour Party policy that there shouldn't be nuclear weapons in Scotland. They're very, very about it at the moment, have been for some time, and there's a lot of division in their ranks, but it's still quite clearly Labour Party policy. So Scotland will make its own decisions. The SNP post-independence standing an election. I don't think the SNP would ever turn their back on their anti-nuclear policy, and it would be in our manifesto. It would be in the Green Party manifesto. It would be interesting to see what Labour would do with that. But at the end of the day, the joy of independence is free and fair elections, and people make their own decisions based on what they've been told in the run up to that election. So I don't think the SNP would waver. I don't think the Greens would waver. Labour, I think they're just opportunists. So when push came to shove and they had to actually declare, I suspect the Labour Party membership would be opposed to nuclear weapons.
It's interesting you talk about Labour and their not quite so much prevarication as sort of flippy floppiness, perhaps. I'm
Let's not
thinking about
talk
this.
about it. Yeah,
I'm
go on,
thinking
talk
here
about
about
it.
I'm thinking here about the Section 30 order that Alistair Jack has in many ways very bizarrely decided to decided to foist on Scotland, in saying that they will he's going to sort of block the Gender Recognition Act and not allow it to go forward for getting the King's approval. Now, Labour came out and sort of was saying, well, Labour in England was saying, well, this is, of course, this is quite right and proper. Well, what's the Scottish government doing? Then Keir Starmer was sort of very much again mirroring Alistair Jack and not really seeming to understand what the purpose of the legislation was for, and and yet Monica Lennon MSP and others were Paul Sweeney referred to Alistair Jack as a viceroy. So there was huge outrage amongst I mean actually across the political parties. Even among those Tories who had voted for the Gender Recognition Act were astonished. Um,
Mm.
and yet Keir Starmer today has come out saying, "Oh yeah, well actually, it's hey, I'm not meaning to come out against trans people when I'm saying all this." So I mean, some of the arguments that I was hearing, on the day that Alistair Jack announced that, people really seem to not understand the fundamental differences between Scotland and England in terms of, the fact that people can leave school at a different age, people can get married at a different age, people can vote at a different age. And so when you consider what has happened with the Section 35, do you think that this is shining a light on the gulf of understanding between Scotland's civic society approach and politics in England, and even between the different branch offices and the headquarters? I mean, what's your take on it? What's the your
Aye,
feeling on this?
right. Well, aside from the issue, which we'll talk about as a separate issue, the GRR bill, um, the issuing of a Section 35 order for the first time, to me, is no more than the government just making it very, very plain that they're in charge. Right. It's the first time it's ever been used. I've read all the justifications that came out along with the Section 35 order. And whilst I'm not a legal bod, I wouldn't pretend to be. But I was looking at it and thinking, but wait a minute, you know, uh, where's the real justification for this? I mean, one part it goes on about how you can't have things different in constituent parts of the UK. Well, of course you can. My goodness, you could go into England and drive about after a couple of pints and then cross the border into Scotland and get done for having too much alcohol while you're driving. That's different. You already mentioned, Ruth, the fact that you can get married at 16 in Scotland without parental consent. You can't do that in England. It's just another example of they being in charge. I think there's a mixture in this one. The reason it's this particular subject is because they've seen that or their perception is that it's divisive. I'm not convinced it's divisive for any more than the political village, to be honest. I think it's a fairly small number of people who are getting themselves very exercised about this. So there's that reason, and the other reason being they've been quite clearly looking for a wedge to stick in place to upset the Scottish government and make it look, as if it's the Scottish government causing all this trouble. So that has suited them as well. Keir Starmer, well, I have to say, he should be joining the Lib Dems because he's getting heck of a good at sitting in fences on an awful lot of things. And boy, is he in the fence in this one. Now, there was an overwhelming vote by Scottish Labour for this legislation. That seems to have been ignored completely. Starmer hasn't backed them in any way whatsoever. Very, very plain that we do have a Labour branch office sitting in Scotland and sitting in the Parliament. And I was really pleased to see the three people in the Labour group in our Parliament who came out strongly about this. I was delighted to see that was Monica Lennon, Mercedes Villalba, and Paul Sweeney. And good on them, because that takes guts, you know. It's never easy to speak out when it is seen as being against your leadership. So that took guts, and there must be real passion there. It's something they really, really care about, and they are seeing an erosion of devolution in this, and that's hugely important because if they get away with this and they do it, they'll just do something else. I mean, we could also talk about, the fact that they are doing this levelling up stuff and doing it direct from the UK government. The fact that they are badging all their offices in Scotland, as they are. It's all about saying, do you know what? You guys have got far too uppity, and we're just going to slap you right down. There's been examples over the years of this happening. I think back to um, there was issues with Gordon Brown about council funding to do with housing benefit. There was issues way back when Henry McLeish was trying to bring in free personal care about attendance allowance, money's been stopped. There's always been issues that have come up, but this is the first time in 20 years that they have said, you're not doing it and we're going to stop you. And
But is it
it's for
not
no more
strange? I
than
mean,
other things.
is it not strange that they've decided an issue that has such cross-party support? That's the bit I can't quite get my head around. There are a number of bills that
Yeah.
the SNP have put through, or the SNP and the Greens have put through, that if they were going to try and score points, they that this is just the SNP and the Greens doing this. Um, then perhaps they might have kind of got away with it. But to have such an obvious assault that even Christine Jordan is standing up, as Stephen Flynn refers to her as a reasonable unionist, that even Christine Jordan is standing up saying, "You are making my life much harder as a unionist to keep the argument
Mm-hmm.
for the union when you're behaving in such an anti-democratic
Mm-hmm.
way." For like Mark Drakeford to be standing up and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
good for
and
him.
so
Mhm.
it's very interesting that actually from my point of view, I'm not sure what it is that Alistair Jack was trying to achieve, other than a bit of willy waving,
Uh,
constitutional
I
willy
think
waving,
there's
if you'll pardon the phrase.
I think there's a few issues in there. I mean, I don't think we should forget. I can't remember the exact wording of it or terminology of it, but the Tories previously said they would be looking at the whole issue of gender recognition certificates and things, and then they backtracked on it. They backtracked on that. So I think that they are. There's that element of it. They're probably getting a lot of hassle from some of their own people on this who are seeing an opportunity for it to be ditched completely. They already said they were ditching it in England. They've seen an opportunity to get it ditched completely. But I also think there's another issue. I think their tails are up. They're feeling quite good because of the Supreme Court decision about Scotland not having the right to run its own referendum. So I think there's a bit of that. They think they're on a winning streak here and they can just keep going and blutter us. Um, So, and I think that's part of the reasoning behind it. But we shouldn't look for too much sense behind it, Ruth, because when you look at the decisions that the Conservative Party have been making over the last years and the absolute mess that they're in as well, we should never make the mistake of thinking that something is well thought out. I think an awful lot of what they do is reactive. And Alistair Jack, with his appendage waving, um, thinks he's a big guy. And I see that he's refused to come and give any answers to the Human Rights and Equality Commission in our Parliament, committee in our Parliament. He's just said no, he's not coming. I think he said it's because he deals with the Constitution. Well, this is about the Constitution. So let's hope that he will agree to go to the Constitution Committee and discuss it there. But they also
But
have a
it's
record of
interesting.
not touching their party.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing there, isn't it? He deals with the Constitution, and yet he's brought in a Section 35 order over an equalities matter. So, and now refuses to go to an equalities committee. And in terms of the levelling up issue, I mean, Rishi Sunak today, he's quite a prickly character when he, when he finds himself being challenged. He doesn't really, he's not very comfortable once he's sort of out from the sort of
Oh,
the pet
just
press.
mm.
Yeah, he gets a wee bit. As you can almost see his wee short
You can
trousers
see
kind
his
of
wee shoulders
flexing.
going up and his hackles go
Aye,
up one by one.
he kind of
Eh,
gets a wee bit. He gets a wee bit sort of a wee bit prickly. But I was watching him when he was in Morecambe today. And he was quite happy when he had people fawning over him. But when he started being asked the tricky questions, like why are you taking yet another internal flight, and what about HS2, and what about the fact that the southeast is getting more money than the so-called red wall? And he keeps trying to find all these ways to come up with platitudes and justifications, but one wonders how much he what kind of advice he's getting, because when he actually is meeting people that don't agree with him, he seems to struggle. And there was even
mm,
a Tory, Andy Street, the Tory West Midlands mayor, condemned the Levelling Up Fund and said the bidding and begging bowl culture is broken, and said that he looked forward to greater devolution for the sort of mayoral system, this sort of new federal system we're being
mm.
sort of insinuated might begin to happen a little bit in England. Now, that surely speaks of a government that is in some difficulty. And if they can't handle devolution in
Yes.
Scotland, how are they going to cope with devolution in England?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak's uncomfortable in the role. That's the feeling I always get. While people are being nice, it's okay. And but the minute he gets into difficulties, I think he's uncomfortable. I don't think he's getting great advice. I mean, there's a phrase he uses that irritates me terribly, which is he keeps saying it. What people want is. Sorry, you have no idea what people want. And it makes me think that he's being told what people want. And I think he's so out of touch that he believes what his advisors tell him in an awful lot of ways. And it's almost as if he can't quite understand why we're not happy. Um, and when you look at the levelling up stuff, they're trying to make such a big deal out of this. However, the amount of funding that's been cut from so many places, whether it be through local authority uh, cuts, whether it be the loss of money because of Brexit into particular areas, all of that, and we're all supposed to welcome hugely this levelling fund. And then when you look at the breakdown, and yes, the south of England's getting a load, including Rishi Sunak's constituency. Now, that was a boast he made during his leadership contest. And then you look at the actual breakdown in the north of England, there's more areas that have got Tory MPs than Labour MPs that are getting the funding. It all starts to get a bit murky, a bit suspicious. That old phrase, pork barrel politics. Is that what's going on here? And it wouldn't surprise me because they've got away with so much over the last few years. It's stunning what the current Conservative government since 2010 have got away with. Absolutely stunning and still getting away with. So I think they just think they can do anything.
But I
And
mean, how
I
does
don't
it?
think
How do you think that they're planning to use it in terms of the levelling up fund? It sometimes looks as though it's a pretty blunt instrument, and you know the way, for example, in Scotland that they use levelling up promises of levelling up funds to try
mhm,
and sort of go straight to councils or go straight
yeah,
to constituency MP, you know, pretty much constituencies where there
I,
are Tory MPs and sitting, and and it does make you wonder how. I mean, if we had a functioning media, then I think that we should be hearing a little bit more about that rather than baby boxes and ferries. And I mean, for
mhm.
example, you know, Rishi Sunak's talking about you know. Oh, soon we're going to be doing well enough that we can cut taxes. Well, I mean, it seems that Nadeem Zahawi has been trying to do that for himself through sort of unusual
Aye,
means and channels.
aye.
That
We're not
you know,
hearing
I
much
mean,
about that
so
either in the mainstream media.
no, and so
That's
I
annoying.
guess the concern yeah, I mean, it's less of an annoyance and more of a serious concern that what is you know
Mm,
when you see there's actually quite a lot of senior journalists now leaving. Um,
uh-huh,
so
uh-huh.
how is it possible to get these messages across and get that out to a wider media, a wider public, or do you think now when we're seeing so many people out going out on strike talking to each other, do you think that perhaps there is a momentum that building that people are finding their information elsewhere, or you know I'm because I think that a functioning democracy needs good, strong, healthy journalism, and one of
Of
the
course it
reasons I
does.
take part in this program is because I'm so concerned. So I'm always happy to support something that might try and buck that trend, but it is a concern, is it not, that we're not
I think it's a
getting.
huge concern. Yeah, well, but, I mean, we've got a few really, really good journalists in Scotland. Really good journalists. My concern is that they're not being allowed to do their job properly. There seems to be an editorial policy going on, which is almost like you're just a region, therefore concentrating your regional government. So everything is about hammering the Scottish government, about hammering the SNP, and never looking at the wider picture. And there's, I think we've lost a lot of journalists, good journalistic piece, and I think some of that might be some of the reasoning behind their going elsewhere. I think it's all unhealthy, and it gets back to that thing about there being a UK establishment. It's not just the politicians, it's the money people, and that includes a lot of the media, it includes a lot of business, banking, financial services. All these folk, they're all part of the UK establishment who think it is in their best interest for the UK establishment to remain, and therefore they have influence in what's happening everywhere else. I mean, I despair when I listen to BBC Scotland now and then at some of the uh, just some of the ways that things are said, the headlines that are put out, and yet they've got some really good journalists as well. There must be a frustration among some of them too, that the editorial policy is such that they cannot do what they must know is the right thing to do. I think there's another element too, which is it suits the Tories, has suited them for a long, long time, for people to disengage. And we've talked about this before, that if people disengage and just think, oh, you're all the same, there's no point in listening to anything, that then leads to fewer people voting. And that suits them as well, because they are always speaking to their own self interest. And if they can marginalise everyone else, that's okay for them. And I think, all arms of the establishment are in that. We've got to fight it. Social media we moan about a lot, and I do sometimes because I get a bit of abuse now and then. And go, oh, why am I doing this? But I suspect it does more good than harm because people do get their news in different ways. Sometimes I despair when I talk to people and think, oh, they're not that interested in what's going on, or they don't know this, or they don't do that. But very often I am stunned at the level of knowledge that sometimes those who you would think were most unlikely have, particularly amongst young people. I know we hear all this talk about young people are not interested in news and everything else. A lot of them are. And a lot of them know what's going on. They just don't talk about it much. So
Or they don't talk about it,
I
just us old
refuse.
fogies.
Well, that's probably it. What they want to talk to me for, or you for, talk to each other. So I refuse to allow myself to get really negative about this stuff. We have some great stuff online. I mean, this program's super. Get people mention it and talk about it quite often. Um, there's other online platforms as well that people get their news from. And then there's discussions amongst folk too. So, stay positive, but we should always be trying to pull out the worst excesses of that lot down the road because they're absolutely appalling.
I think part of the problem that we're seeing now, though, is that because the the budget, the Scottish budget, has had such a shock following the sort of the bizarre spree of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, on top
Yeah.
of the catastrophe that is the economic sort of just the economic powder keg that's happening coming out of London.
Uh-huh.
But so austerity, this absolutely bizarre adherence to neoliberalism and this constant quest for a growth economy rather than a well-being economy. And so I mean yesterday I saw there's great joy because they're going, oh yes, Lithuania and Latvia, they've got higher inflation than we do, their economy is worse than ours. But actually it had already been explained in previous programs with other economists that because their wider economy was doing better, they could withstand the effects of the point whatever of inflation that they
Yes.
had, whereas ours is just so our economy is so depressed. You've got the
Yeah.
French having demonstrations because Macron wants to raise their retirement age to 63 or 64 or something,
Yeah.
and yeah, and the rest of
Yes.
us are all like, oh, yeah, I'd love that, thanks. But in all seriousness, the issue that I think we're going to face in Scotland very soon is that you see Glasgow Council talking about cutting teaching posts, and uh, you've got all of the councils faced with significant issues in terms of funding shortfall because of what's happening in Westminster, because of the cuts to the
Yep.
budget, and yet of course it is the local councillors, it will be perceived as being Scotland's fault that our budget is being cut.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
how, I mean, there's only so much mitigation that can be done to mitigate against, your budget being slashed. How does that message get across? And how well do you think people know who really to blame when you see what today, watching like the nurses going on strike and hearing that the 999 call operators are going to be going on strike in England and Wales. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying stuff. Do you think that actually one of the reasons that one of the impacts of getting so much news coming up from England and so little news from Scotland is that people perhaps are more aware of where the problem lies? Or do you think if somebody sees that they don't have teachers and they don't get a pay rise and things aren't working the way they should, they'll just go, well, that's the Scottish Government's fault or the local council's fault?
Well, first of all, can I say, when you mentioned, how the UK, the government keep pushing for this growth economy as opposed to a well-being economy. What really gets to me is, yes, they do, but they're not even good at that because they're way bottom of all the tables, for growth of economies. They're rubbish at everything. Ah, useless. But your question about who gets the blame, it's very, very frustrating because, as you say, Ruth, the Scottish Government can't mitigate everything. They're probably I'm not there. I don't know, but I would suspect they're at the end of the potential mitigation because it's been really, really tough. But I have a few folk that I use as my bellwethers and have done for many years. People that I don't discuss politics with, but that I can be quite close to, and people who over the years have expressed no real interest in politics. I use them as my sounding boards quite often. And I have really noticed that it's the Tories who are getting the blame from this small sample of people that I'm talking about. They're in absolutely no doubt who's to blame. And they see it all the time. And I've even, had this sort of general sympathy for the Scottish Government. I was speaking to a bunch of teachers the other night, just by chance, ended up in company of some teachers, and they were actually, it was a difficult one, but they were annoyed at the Scottish Government, but it was in terms of they felt the Scottish Government weren't talking to them properly. Now, I don't know the rights or wrongs of that, but that was their concern. But as far as finance was concerned, there was a recognition that probably the Scottish Government doesn't have it because of the cuts that have come from the Westminster Government. So I think people generally do realise. I think some of that is informed by the fact that nobody, surely nobody, not even a hard Tory, could say that the government down there has been successful over the last few years. It's just been such a mess. So I think some of these views are informed by that. There is absolutely no confidence at all in the current government in Westminster. Therefore, people see that they are actually to blame. Especially when, as you said, I mean, the money that was blown by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, on top of what was blown by Boris Johnson and others beforehand, I mean, that really was out of the park.
So the interesting thing that I noticed the other day was that the Daily Telegraph was one of the authors who has for many years been lauding Brexit as a fantastic opportunity. Wrote a column saying, the great experiment has failed. We must now rejoin the EU and quickly, which just had
Oh,
me falling off my seat. But this is at
yeah.
the same time that we are seeing the EU. I'll get to it's a lengthy one. The EU, the retained EU law revocation and reform bill currently going through
Aye.
Parliament. Now, this is something that through a number of channels I've been trying to raise awareness about for a number of years, because although this particular bill, I couldn't quite foresee how bad it was going to be, I had a fairly good inkling that something like this was going to appear
Mm,
at some point, because it wasn't, of course, sort of one of the natural outcomes of Brexit. And what really concerns me is the sunsetting clause on the December the
yes.
31st, 2023, then any law any EU law that is still in our books, which is the statute books, which has not been addressed or modified, will fall off the statute books. Not only will it fall off the statute book, but if Parliament hasn't had time to discuss anything, then it will be the cabinet ministers in the Tory government. Presumably, it
Mm,
will still be the Tory government by then, and presumably, it may be, Rishi Sunak, who still is even prime minister then. Who knows?
mm-hmm,
A day is a long time in politics for the Conservative Party these days. But the potential for extremely bad laws to be written and forced through without parliamentary
mm-hmm,
debate, um, and the loss of our rights. I mean, women's working rights, maternity leave,
mm-hmm,
paternity. I mean,
mm-hmm.
basically anything that's good that's happened in the last
Yes.
50 years could just get swept away. And so,
Mm-hmm,
and this kind of circles back almost onto the Section 35, because
uh-huh,
obviously the Scottish government has got so many laws in the Scottish Parliament, that Scottish laws
mm-hmm,
relating to the way that Scotland would like things to be, and I wonder how much actually these two things tie in together. That the Section 35 is a precursor bringing to sort of sweeping the way for a precedent for the power grab. Sort of that sort of
Mhm.
consent is assumed as being given, whether it's given or not or denied,
Mhm.
and for a
Mhm.
number of these EU laws that are going to be removed. What's
I-
your view on the matter,
I don't
and have you been speaking to anybody who perhaps has got other views on it within the Scottish
know.
government?
No, I haven't. I don't get to speak to people in the Scottish government anymore, Ruth. um, do you know, again, it's just a stunning thing that's going through. And as you say, that sunset clause, they don't even know how many directives and pieces of legislation they're dealing with. I mean, the UK government, first of all, said there was, I think they said there was about 2,500. And then the National Archives came up and said, no, there's another 1,500. They don't even know how many they're talking about. Now, there's a lot of stuff there. If I'm being perfectly honest here, there's going to be a lot of stuff there through EU directives and everything else that actually won't matter that much. But there's a heck of a lot of stuff there that does. You're talking employment law, you're talking conservation areas, you're talking about environmental concerns, GM foods, all these different things. Uh, and I've heard a few Tories say, oh, it's not going to affect employment law. And you bet your bottom dollar it will when the Tories are at the helm. So it's huge. There's starting to be some rebellion in the Tory ranks about it, I hear, which is good. I understand that the Lords are up in arms. My goodness, they're doing something for their attendance allowance. They're not happy about it either. Uh, the UK government may look for an excuse to extend that sunset clause. They may use the Lords to do it. But I'm pretty sure that they will be winnowing out the things that they want to change. They're not going to just go through this systematically. They're going to look for the things that they want to change, and they will be given priority. And yes, they will ride roughshod over Scotland, over Wales, and over the north of Ireland. But while all this is going on, the Northern Ireland Protocol isn't sorted out yet. So it's a complete burach, and I was glad to see some of our MPs in Westminster, like Alan Smith, who's got a real grasp of all this stuff, up in arms about it and giving out information.
It's something which is I've written about in the past in some of my newspaper columns, and I'm looking to try and find the exact figure, and I can't quite find it, but I think it's somewhere in the region of 2,400 clauses or laws that actually specifically pertain to food and drink, animal welfare, and the environment. I mean, it's absolutely immense. Food Standards Scotland has been doing a significant body of work trying to raise awareness about this, because obviously from their point of view, it's we're looking at not huge potential for another horse meat scandal, at the
Mm-hmm.
very least. You've got the whole animal welfare issue. You've got I mean, it's how are businesses supposed to prepare for what might happen on January the 1st if they don't
Well, even the
know
chambers of
what's happening with
commerce are
that?
up. Yeah, even the chambers of commerce are saying, "Look, this is ridiculous. It's been rushed through." And something just struck me there when you mentioned animal welfare. You know, this Section 35 stuff about you can't have something different in Scotland from the rest of the UK. Animal welfare. We have different animal welfare legislation in Scotland than the rest of the UK does, for example. So there's loads of stuff that we have that's different. I think they're looking for uniformity, and that they will go for uniformity across the UK, just to, again, to keep us in our place and try, try to just reduce us to another region rather than supposedly a partner in the union.
But a whole part of Scotland's brand, for example, is the full life traceability of
Hmm.
Scotch beef, Scotch lamb. So if we were to go for that uniformity, then you would end up in a situation where, as happens in England, like a calf can be brought in from anywhere. As long as it spends
Uh-huh.
30 days on that farm, they can say that
Yeah.
it's
Mm.
it's
And
it's their
also
it's it's their meat.
that invidious thing that's going on as well already, though, a frustration. There's fewer and fewer large supermarket chains badging any food as Scottish anymore. It's all UK, British best. So that's been happening, and that's ongoing. Trying to find something that says produced in Scotland is becoming more and more difficult in the standard supermarket chains. Where's that coming from?
Well,
Um,
that grew out of the Great campaign, which was David Cameron's campaign, which he actually got sort of royally roasted for in 2011 when he suggested it. He was mocked in the Daily Telegraph, and then in 2015. I don't know what must have happened in 2014 to make them think it was a good idea, but that was when the Great campaign, the Great British campaign, was launched,
gosh,
and that
managed to
was
block
when
that
it
out of my
came
mind.
across.
Just
Well,
flag that.
I was returning from overseas and walked into the supermarket and just about fell over when I saw it, and so the Keep Scotland the Brand campaign was born. Um, but
But there's
but
also
I mean,
I can't remember, not I was just going to say I can't remember what you call it, but through Europe you have the protected like
protected
whiskey.
geographic indicators and protected designated
Oh,
product of
well done.
designated
That's the
origin.
very thing. Yes, the very thing. Stornoway black pudding, whiskey stuff. Now, is that going to disappear as well? Is that going to
Well,
become
no, that's that. So that already is. The UK government is has brought in its own scheme, but
oh,
it's only kind of valid in the UK. I think that there's still a bit of a hangover of that, but yes, it will finally go at the end of this year,
so we're going to
unless
have
it is
British
written.
whiskey?
Well, no. So Scotch whisky is unique in that it is the only PGI in the world that is held by the organisation rather than by the
Oh,
government.
well,
It is unique.
thank you.
You heard it here. You heard it here.
Heard it, yeah.
So,
I'm relieved about that. But I'm a bit worried about my Stornoway black pudding as well, I have to say.
well, and so you should be, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, and again, this brings us back to the other big issue of the day, as Stephen Flynn and the First Minister has said, which is in order to protect our Stornoway black pudding and many other aspects of Scotland's economy, Scotland's council budget, Scotland's NHS. This is the reason why the SNP and the Greens, the Scottish government, pardon me, is working for Scottish independence. Now,
Mm-hmm.
recently uh, there's been quite a bit of conversation about the way in which that potentially that question would be asked again,
Mm.
given the Supreme Court ruling that Scotland is not a colony and so cannot have a referendum without permission from the Westminster government because of the line in the Scotland Act that was inserted by Labour, I believe. Um, so what is your view on the various suggestions that have been put forward that's a de facto referendum, whether that be held as a number of votes in a Westminster election, or should it be a number of seats in a Westminster election, or as one suggestion I've seen is that the next Westminster election, it may be that the question would be asked once more for a Section 30 order, and I presume that's in case somehow Labour have got in and things have changed, and for the international community to think that Scotland has kept on trying to go down the Section 30 route, and if that doesn't work, then to go for Holyrood as a plebiscite election, in which case I presume it would be the constituency vote rather than the list vote. That would be because that's just one person, one tick in a box. Now, all of this sounds. Oh, of course, and then you've got the tranche. You go, oh, the first minister should just resign, and then we can, that'll bring down the Scottish Parliament, and we'll all bets are off. for
My,
for 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 those people who are trying to have a quiet and dignified conversation among ourselves, how are we supposed to view all of these options?
right.
If a Section 30 is the gold standard, or how do nations that are denied a vote, how do they go about it?
Mm.
And
Well, there's a.
I'm looking at, Ireland. You've got
I
the
know.
Republic of Ireland in 2020, I mean 29, in sort of 1919, I think it was. They did it just with, I think it was 40% of the MPs. They just went, right, that's
Mm.
fine. We've got enough MPs now. We're going to do it, or
Well,
44% of the vote.
I mean, I think the international community is really important for Scotland. We want to be part of Europe, an active part of Europe. The one thing I would discount is the Scottish Parliament. I mean, I don't think the public would forgive the Scottish government if they just suddenly downed tools and walked, not in the midst of everything that's happening. And the other element of it, I mean, what do you end up with? The presiding officer, if I remember rightly, has the right to put a first minister in if it came to keep things going. So, I mean, I really don't think we want Douglas Ross as first minister. So I think we can just completely discount that. Now, I am a member of the SNP, and we've got our special conference coming up. So the two options that have been generally talked about are the next Westminster election, that comes first, uh, and the Westminster election, the SNP and any other, parties who there's an agreement with, would stand on a ticket of independence very, very plainly and fight that election and that and look for a majority. The other option is that you wait till the next Holyrood election and fight on a ticket of referendum. So these are two options that have been put out for the SNP as a party to consider. I don't know if the Greens are doing something similar, I've no idea. But the SNP is doing that. And I think the amendments, possible amendments to go in from branches and constituencies are sort of mid-February, and they will all be looked at and discussed. So I'm actually looking forward to that discussion, because there's some very knowledgeable and clever people who will be at that conference. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing all the discussion about what they see as the best way forward. And neither of these two might come through. Um, there could be other motions going for discussion as well, and the membership will vote on that. So, I mean,
What's
there's
your
a
view,
bit of
and what do
me.
you think?
Well, at the moment, I am personally leaning towards using the West section, uh, but I'm not leaning towards putting a sort of, oh, it has to be 50 plus 5 or 50 plus 2%. I think if we get the majority of constituency seats in a Westminster election on a ticket of Scotland should be an independent country, and that's what our manifesto says, please vote for us, I believe that should be enough. Um, I've looked at some of the sort of international norms and stuff, and if it's very carefully done, that could be given to us as a referendum. And I'm sure there are much greater minds than mine working on all that stuff just now. That's where I'm leaning on a personal level at the moment. But my mind is open to discussion because I want to hear the experts' opinions. My heart says that this should happen as soon as possible, but my head says I want it to be successful. So I'm willing to listen to all the arguments that come up at the special conference. But I want to hear international opinion. I want to hear legal opinion from Scotland as well. I'm reading some of it just now. More to go. What are
Well,
you thinking?
certainly, it. I'm presenting this program. I can't have an opinion because I am, of course, a neutral
Thought it was
journalist
a.
in this affair. But what I think is it would be good to have these conversations while there's still a Scottish Parliament that has powers and funding, because I'm never quite sure what Westminster's plans are, and I think that is a serious concern. Well, I'm looking at the time, so we don't have time to talk about Andy Murray, but
Oh
yay,
my,
go Andy!
Andy Murray,
So
yay!
so the hour has flown by. That's it for this evening. My thanks go to our fantastic guest this evening, Linda Fabiani. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Pleasure.
But before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland is very dependent on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who signs up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, and how many people have got £5 a month spare at the moment, I know, given the cost of living crisis, but if you are one of those people, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff and staff that we paid a fair living wage to make more programmes. Be part of the television revolution. Good night, and thank you for watching.